Well, greetings and salutations, test takers. This is Dean Tenney, aka the Series 7 Guru, coming to you live from my studio here in fabulous Las Vegas. This is the second episode of our podcast series on the SIE exam. And we're going to be talking about tonight equity securities. And next episode will be debt security. So we'll be talking this evening. By the way, I'm kind of not doing it in the order of the content outline published by FINRA. I'm doing it in the order of how many performance opportunities you're going to see on the exam. So I'm starting with section 2, as you see here, understanding products tonight and risks of equity securities. And this category is 33 questions, 44% of your exam. So that's kind of the game plan of why I'm doing this section 2 first. And this evening, we'll be talking about equity securities. We'll be talking about common stock. We'll be talking about preferred stock. Rights and warrants are considered equity securities because when you exercise them, that provides the issuer, in this case, the corporation, with additional equity financing. We'll be talking about that. And we'll be talking about American depository receipts. Now, there are various forms of business ownership. And the form we're going to be talking about tonight is the corporate form of ownership. Various forms of business structures, right? There's partnerships, there's LLCs, there's sole proprietorships, but we'll be talking about the corporate form. And if you're going to form a corporation, what you're going to do is get a corporate charter. That is the legal document that's going to govern the governance of that corporation. And there's no such thing as a corporation that doesn't have common stock. So we're going to issue common stock, and we want to keep it simple. We may decide to just capitalize with common stock and no other types of capitalization. We may choose not to issue preferred. We may choose not to issue bonds. So, we can make that decision. But in the corporate charter, when you own common stock, you're an owner. And one of the things that's going to be really important is to stipulate the maximum number of shares the corporation can issue under terms of its charter, right? So if the maximum number of shares is 2 million shares, well, then we issue 1 million, we got 1 million left. Now, if you get this on your exam, more often than not, it is a recognition question. A, B, C, D, the maximum number of shares a corporation can issue under terms of its charter, and you would say authorized. In my example, let's assume we authorize 2 million shares, and we choose to issue 1 million of those. P.S. if we want to issue more than that, we're going to have to update the corporate charter, right? It requires shareholder vote. But we, in my example, are going to issue 1 million shares. Issued shares, again, recognition, are shares that have been placed with investors. So in our example, we have a corporation that's authorized in its charter to issue 2 million shares. It's issued 1 million. Now, we wouldn't expect early in the life stage for the company to have treasury stock. Issued, less treasuries outstanding. Looks like I got a typo in my banner there. Oh, well. And we don't have any treasury stock. But if we're a mature, stable business, one of the things we might do is decide to buy stock into the treasury. For example, Berkshire Hathaway is tendering to its shareholders. Would you like to tender or sell your shares back to Berkshire Hathaway? They spent $6 billion last quarter buying back their stock. I thought it was interesting that Berkshire Hathaway did that to a tender to its existing shareholders rather than doing it in the secondary market. There's two ways for Berkshire Hathaway to buy stock into the treasury. Sometimes we refer to this stock as stock that is being retired. And I thought Mr. Buffett's conversation was interesting. He said, well, I don't want to pay brokers in the secondary market. I'd rather just go directly to the shareholders. Now, if we make a tender to shareholders, whether it's this or some other item, that tender has to be open for 20 days. So if you receive the tender for Berkshire Hathaway, you're a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder, and the company, the corporation's offered to buy back its stock, you would have 20 days to make your decision on that. Now, that treasury stock has no voting rights. It's important to know treasury stock, preferred stock, has no voting rights. In this case, it's treasury stock, and treasury stock pays no dividends. Now, when you own common stock, what you own, or you're as an owner, we're doing this live, by the way. I'm seeing that there's no comments. I might be having technical issues, but if you do have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. And if I see them, I'll be more than happy to take care of them for you. All right. So as an owner, we have certain rights and privileges. And one of the rights and privileges we have is the right to vote on matters pertaining to the corporation. And once again, the style of voting that we would have, either statutory, cumulative, and who knows, we might even have some super voting shares. That would be found as well in the corporate charter. Most corporations are statutory. Boring. If there's 3 board seats, that's the one thing we tend to vote on. Again, matters pertaining to the corporation, including the board. And if I own 100 shares and the 3 board seats, 100 yes, no, 100 yes, no, 100 yes, no. Boring. I think of it as kind of like propositions on the ballot. In each of the propositions, I get to vote yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. It would be more fun if the propositions on the ballot, there were 3 of them, and I could vote, 3 yes, no on anything that I chose to. Might be cumulative. If it's cumulative, I multiply the number of things we're voting on by my shares. In my example, we have 100 shares, 3 board seats. I have 300 shares, and I can spend them in any fashion I would like. And that cumulative voting allows us to protect minority shareholders. The idea is I can put all my votes on that particular board seat or whatever it happens to be. That would be cumulative voting. And then some companies like Ford Motor Company has super voting shares. Facebook has super voting shares. And that simply means they have a common stock, but it's got more than 1 vote per share. For example, in the Ford Motor Company, the Ford Motor B stock is owned by the Ford family and it has 100 shares per vote. Woo! I know you're not surprised. I bet you probably guess at Facebook who has the shares that instead of having 1 vote per share, have 1,000 shares votes per share. That'd be Zuckerberg, right? So, hold on. The Super Z share hasn't voted. So again, statutory, 100 shares, 3 board seats, 100 yes, no, 100 yes, no. Cumulative, 100 shares, 3 board seats, 300, protects minority shareholders more. And then super voting is more than 1 vote per share. Oh, good. We got some comments coming in. Yeah, you're always going to have the max. The max is that. Judy, I'm not sharing my screen. It's live. I think you can see me. I hope there's a video there of me. I hope. And if your comment isn't germane, I'll probably just, if you have questions about anything, just put it in there. And then what isn't, any comment or question you have that isn't part of our discussion on SIE, more than happy at the end of this podcast episode to take care of that for you. All right. So another thing we vote on is tenders. We said tenders, not all tenders, but for example, the Twitter shareholders had a tender made to them by X Holdings. And X Holdings said, how would you like to tender your shares in Twitter at $54.20? So we don't only get to vote on the board, we get to vote on other matters pertaining to the corporation. And so this offer, again, is a tender offer. This is going to be voted on the shareholders of Twitter about whether or not they would like to tender their shares for $54.20 in cash. And they decided to do so. Now, when you receive that cash, that's going to be a taxable event. So in terms of corporate actions, if you're receiving stock in an acquisition, like if I'm a Fox shareholder and I get, for example, Disney shares, that's not taxable. But if I actually am accepting a cash offer from Berkshire Hathaway, for example, on the tender for the stock they want to buy into the treasury, or I'm accepting a tender for my Twitter stock from X Holdings, that's going to be taxable. So one of the things we said, you were talking about the rights and privileges you have as a common stockholder. And another right or privilege you have is what's called a preemptive right. Your preemptive right is your right to maintain proportionate ownership. In our example, we had a hypothetical working on where we had 1 million shares that were issued. We had 2 million shares authorized. So in our example, we had 1 million shares that are authorized but on issue. And if that company goes to issue that corporation, that other 1 million shares, and you don't buy any, you're going to get diluted. Your proportionate ownership is going to get cut in half. By the way, it kind of makes sense that if we're raising additional equity financing, that we're first going to go to our existing owners and say, hey, how would you like to provide some more equity financing to us? Now, very important, we can ask politely for our existing shareholders to provide additional equity financing through subscription to their rights, but we can't demand that. If they don't come through, we'll sell the stock elsewhere and they'll get diluted. But it's very important to know that in the rights offering, that's the mechanism we're going to be using. And in the rights offering, the rights test question are short-term and exercisable at issuance below the market price. That's to give you an incentive to invest. We say, listen, if we can get this money, the corporation, directly from our shareholders, we can save money by not paying an investment banker. And we're going to pass that savings on to you, our shareholders. And if you'd like to subscribe, you would simply send your rights, as many shares as you have. That's how many rights you have, by the rights needed, given information, not something I'd worry about on the SIE. But I'd send that in the rights transfer agent with my subscription price, and I will have exercised my preemptive right, and I will maintain my proportionate ownership. But if not, you can certainly decide perhaps to sell those to someone else. Now, one thing that's important is the ability to contrast on your exam rights with warrants. How test question are rights differ from warrants. Both rights and warrants are issued by a corporation. But if a corporation is issuing warrants, that's typically as a sweetener, an incentive to buy some other security. And a warrant is long-term, test question, exercisable above the current market price. For example, I call you and I say, hey, listen, I'd like you to buy 100 bonds here from this biotech company. I'd like you to lend them $100,000. The coupon, the nominal yield is 6%. And so you would be getting $6,000 in annual interest, 2 payments of $3,000 apiece on January 1st and July 1st, 10 years to maturity, assuming they don't default, $103,000. Yeah, maturity. Your principal, last interest check. And you say, well, Dean, everything goes according to plan. I make 6% on a biotech company that has quite a bit of risk involved. What's the rating on the bonds? I said, well, they're not rated. I said, hey, I agree with you. If that's all I had for you, maybe you take a pass. But hold on. This is a unit. A unit is more than one security offered together. Here comes the sweetener. Sweeteners get people to buy things they might not otherwise buy. Here's the sweetener. For the next 10 years out to 2033, you can buy the stock at 6. And you say, well, gee, Dean, that doesn't make any sense right now. I said, well, right now that makes no sense. But, if they come with a cure for cancer or something, that could make a lot of sense. For example, as a sweetener to get Berkshire Hathaway to provide some financing to Bank of America during the financial crisis, Bank of America provided a sweetener, 700 million warrants to buy Bank of America common. And, the strike price on those warrants was $7.15. And at the time, the stock was 6. It didn't make any sense then. But Berkshire Hathaway exercised all those warrants when Bank of America was 25. So, that makes some sense at that point. But as a test taker, big thing is to be able to contrast rights with warrants. So we're talking about rights you have as a shareholder. You have a right to vote on matters pertaining to the corporation. You have a right to maintain your proportion ownership. What that amounts to is the first right of refusal on the issuance of new shares. And the mechanism for that is what's called a rights offering. And if you have rights, they're short-term exercisable below. And we said you got to be able to contrast that with warrants. And another right you have is a right to a dividend if declared. You do not have a right to a dividend. So be real careful on this. You only have a right to a dividend if declared. For example, Intel recently has said to its shareholders, until further notice, there will be no dividend distributions. We need those resources as retained earnings to keep the business afloat and invest into the business. But assuming they do declare a dividend, you're entitled as a shareholder to your pro rata share of that. And so, the board gets together. In fact, boards will be meeting right now. I'm coming to you October. Corporations have just finished their third quarter. And so at the end of the third quarter, the board is going to review those results. And maybe the board says, hey, let's declare a 21-cent dividend. And they say, okay, well, who are we going to pay it to? Because in the secondary market, our shareholder list is always changing. And we say, we're going to pay it to shareholders as of record. We're going to look at our shareholder list. If your shareholder list on that time, at that time, you're going to get the dividend. So maybe we say, Thursday, October 16th. And then we say we're going to cut the checks on November 1st. Now, there's dates associated with this dividend. And those dates are the declared date, the X date. X is Latin for without. The record date and the payable date. Now, if the record date in my example is Thursday, October 16th, if you buy it on Wednesday, the 15th, you won't be a shareholder as of record, because you definitely should know that corporate securities regular settlement is T+2. So Wednesday, T+1, I'm not on the shareholder list. Now, if I buy it Tuesday, T+1, T+2, I am on the shareholder list. I'd be entitled to that dividend. So the X date is, in this example, going to be Wednesday, one business day prior, Wednesday, October 15th. That's going to be the first date on which the stock no longer trades with the dividend attached. And that's one business day prior to record. I would know that. And again, I shouldn't use that as an artificial sense of urgency. In other words, what's going to happen is the stock is going to go down by the amount of the dividend. So you should know as a test taker, the X date, DERP, is a nice memory aid. Declared X, record payable. And the X is not set by the board of directors. That is a function of the Uniform Practice Code. Now, another thing you might want to be able to do on the test as it relates to stocks that pay dividends is to be able to do what's called the current yield. The current yield is what an investment pays you divided by what it costs you. What it pays you divided by what it costs you. So in a stock, that would be the annual dividend divided by the current market price. Now, on your SIE, there's 3-4 math questions. The vast majority of the exam itself is recognition style questions. But current yield, another thing the board might decide to do is they might decide to declare a stock dividend or a stock split. And if the board declares that, there will be no effective change in your ownership because you have more shares, but so does everybody else. In the video description, I'll link to a full-blown equity lecture. We're trying to keep these podcasts down to 30 minutes or so. But if it's a 3-4-2 split, one trick I would tell you, besides doing the math, if you don't want to do the math, is say, okay, well, I'm going to end up with more shares at a lower price. And sometimes on the test, you can just simply shop your answer set. And whatever is more shares at a lower price, that's typically going to be the right answer. But if it's a 3-for-2, I would take 3 divided by 2 times whatever shares I have. If it would give me my new position. 3 divided by 2, 1.5 times 100. Another thing we need to know about common stock is you're last in line. So, if we can't make a go of it, liquidation. Capitalism without failure is kind of like religion without hell. And, if we liquidate the business, the common stockholders are last in line. And you definitely need to know the order of liquidation. In liquidation, the common is the most junior security. It would be junior, senior, common, preferred stock, secured bonds, unsecured bonds. That's very testable. Or senior to junior, secured bonds, unsecured bonds, preferred stock, and common. Now, that sounds like a bad thing, but that's actually a good thing because, you can't have a stock that goes to -5. That just doesn't happen. Now, let me just check out chat here. I'm not sure about that. If your question isn't about what I'm doing right now, again, I will take care of you at the end of our time together. Right now, we're doing a live recording of a podcast episode for our SIE exam. So no worries. Like I say, when I get done with this, I will then return to the chat and answer those questions that are there that have nothing to do with the SIE exam. All right. So another testable issue before we move on and talk about preferred stock is control stock. Control stock is the stock in the corporation that is owned by officers, directors, and principal stockholders. If I own 10% or more of the company's stock, I'm a principal stockholder. For example, Larry Ellison is a principal stockholder in Oracle. He's an officer, he's a director, and he's a principal stockholder. He owns a couple billion shares of Oracle. We're not going to allow Larry to call his broker and say, sell 2 billion shares of Oracle at the market, because, that would, disturb the public marketplace, right? And there's a dog, that protects the public marketplace. And so what 144 says is that if you have control stock, the control stock is all the stock held by the control persons, that you can't just sell as whenever you want. You're going to have to file what's called Form 144. You have to file that form at or prior to your sales. And so when Larry files this, he's saying, I have the intention over the next 90 days to sell some Oracle stock, dump that into the public marketplace. I'm joking, but, sell it. And then very testable, what he can sell is 1% of the outstanding stock or the average of the last 4 weeks trading volume, whichever is greater. I think the great mnemonic is 144. 1% of the outstanding stock or the average of the last 4 weeks trading volume up to 4 times a year, every 90 days. Now, there's 2 types of stock that Larry might have. He might have some stock that he bought in the open market. That stock is registered. He bought it in the public marketplace. He might also have some stock he receives from Oracle as part of his compensation. He got directly from Oracle. That stock has not been through that registration process. That stock is unregistered. Now, in that stock, he's going to have a 6-month hold. So, he basically has probably 2 buckets of stock, a bucket of stock that is registered that he bought in the public marketplace and a bucket of stock that he got directly from the issuer. Again, it's like learning a foreign language. They say when you dream the foreign language, that's when you know it. So I guess when you have your first SIE exam, that's when you're on the right track. And, that unregistered stock in the old days used to have red letters on it that said stop transfer. So we still refer to unregistered stock sometimes as red letter stock or legend stock. In the old days, restricted stock, restricted in terms of transfer. In the old days, I'd say, gee, where'd you get this stock? Let's get that nasty legend removed, right? So definitely 144, you should know. All right, so we're going to move on now. We're going to be talking about preferred stock. That's kind of our agenda today in episode 2, Equity Securities. And then, as I said, once I get done, I'll return to answer any questions you have about any other things besides what we're working on right now. So preferred stock is called preferred stock because it has preferential treatment in 2 areas. It has preferential treatment in dividends. You cannot pay a dividend to your common stockholders if you're in arrears to your preferred stockholders. And in liquidation. Preferred stock is a senior security, very testable. Senior to the common. You don't buy a preferred stock because you're second to last in line in liquidation. But you do have preferential treatment in dividends and liquidation. And preferred stock, like treasury stock, has no voting rights. So, if I own 50 million shares of preferred stock, I'm not going to be voting on anything. And there's lots of different types of preferred stock. But, in this podcast episode, we're trying to keep it kind of low key, so to speak, and fly high. Like I say, I'll link to a full-blown equity lecture. It's like 90 minutes. But, the 2 basic types we want to be aware of are straight non-cumulative, where it does not go into arrears. If I'm a corporation and I miss my fixed dividend payment to my preferred shareholders, I just try better next time. Or cumulative, where it does go into arrears. If I miss this year and it's $1, and I miss next year, I miss another dollar, it's $2. And then I would have to come up with this year $3, make good to the preferred stockholders before I could actually pay a dividend to common. And we also have convertible preferred stock. Convertible preferred stock allows you to switch your status from being a preferred stockholder into becoming a common stockholder. Now, our next episode is going to be on debt securities. That'll be our next episode, and we'll talk there about convertibles. I wouldn't get too in the weeds as an SIE test taker about calculating parity, but I would have a general idea of what's called the conversion ratio. So, for example, if I buy a preferred stock, I should definitely know that par is 100. That's really important, because if you don't know it's 100, you can't tell me what the dividend is. 5% on 100 is $5. There's, you got to know that. Anyways, if it's has a conversion price of 20, I say, okay, well, that's based on par. So par by 25 shares is that conversion ratio. So I, as a SIE test taker, I'd have a general understanding of that ratio. All right, well, the last thing this evening I want to talk, it looks like I'm on track for my 30-minute episode kind of cap, is American depository receipts. I could buy a foreign security in a foreign market. And why would I buy a foreign security in a foreign market? For additional diversification. Maybe that foreign market has different correlation to U.S. markets, for example. And maybe I decide that what I want to do is buy Telefonos de Mexico. Telefonos de Mexico is the monopoly phone carrier in Mexico. And I could very easily wire the Mexican bourse, the Mexican stock exchange, and buy the Mexican security in the Mexican market. Yeah, but that's kind of a pain because I don't know what the uniform practice code is in terms of settlement. Is it mañana, mañana, mañana? I'm going to get reports in Espanol. That's not helpful because I don't read Espanol. The accounts will be in pesos. So if I want to do that, the easiest way, test question, to facilitate U.S. investors owning or getting exposure to foreign securities is in the context of an American depository receipt. So what I buy instead is the Telefonos de Mexico ADR sponsored by Bank of New York. What I'm buying in the Bank of New York's Mexico City branch, there's 1,000 shares of Telefonos de Mexico, of which I am the beneficial owner. Pretty cool. And then they're going to translate the accounts from pesos to dollars, Espanol to Ingles. It's just a lot more convenient. So test question number 1 is, why would you buy an ADR? To get exposure to a foreign security through the U.S. marketplace, ease of ownership. And then the second test question, you still have currency risk or exchange risk, right? It used to take 10 pesos to get a buck. Now it takes 20 pesos to get a buck. I'm still getting the same dividend, but it's just when we exchange it for dollars, I get half as much. And that would be our second test question about ADRs. Okay, well, that concludes this episode of our SIE exam series podcast. Episode 3 will be debt instruments, and I'll put up that schedule soon. Make sure you check it out if you'd like to. This will be available as a replay on the channel. Remember, inch by inch, your SIE exam is a cinch. Yard by yard, your SIE exam is hard. And now I'll probably edit, boom, cut here, and I'm going to go back and see what you got in chat and what kind of questions you want to have answered. This is the end. If I don't get around to editing this and you see this, you can end now. Let's see what we got in chat or comments.